It's not just the bombardment which is deeply worrying people on the Syrian side of the border. It's the rapid increase in terrorism. The Turkish news agency announced that its forces, or its proxy forces, Syrian Arab forces, had taken control of the M4. That is the main road running east-west. It's about 30 kilometers inside the border on the Syrian side. Well, what happened today? There was an attack along that road. A very prominent women's rights campaigner and Kurdish politician, Havrin Khalaf, she was killed on that road. It was probably an improvised explosive device. There may have been other people killed, we're not quite sure. What we are pretty sure about is that that must have been an ISIS cell. Because when the Kurdish forces, backed by their allies, Britain, America, France, the coalition, when they defeated the ISIS caliphate back in March, some of the ISIS fighters went underground, and the Turkish onslaught has been their moment to come out and start to wreak havoc. So it's not surprising that the Kurdish and other nationality forces, they're not just Kurds, they're also Arabs and Syriac Christians and so on. What they're saying tonight is if America doesn't come back to help them, if Britain doesn't step up, well, who are they going to turn to? They're going to turn to Damascus and Moscow.
Dawn brought artillery and airstrikes. The people of the border town of Ras al-Ain have fled in the face of the four-day Turkish onslaught. The Turks claim they're in control now, as the Arab forces who act as their spearhead have moved into at least part of the town. Their enemy, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, is outgunned and says it will turn to Damascus and Moscow if it gets no help from its Western partners, including Britain, who helped defeat the Islamic State.
The British have special forces here. What do you want the British to do?
Everything. Any means that would help us. We have already asked for a no-fly zone, and if it is applicable, it would be good. If they can send troops to replace the American ones for the security mechanism, it would be good. So all of it is something that we would like to see happening on the ground.
Do you want the British to help you resist Turkey?
Of course. We would like the whole international community, the British, the French, the Europeans in general, the Americans to take their part in and to take their responsibility for the defense of their allies and their partners here in Syria.
This morning, Kurdish TV filmed US forces apparently returning to the border town of Kobani, from where they'd been withdrawn last night after Turkey targeted dangerously close to their base. This was not, presumably, what President Trump envisaged when he gave President Erdogan the green light to attack northeastern Syria. Presumably, he didn't envisage this either. In the early hours of this morning, a motorbike bomb hit a prison containing ISIS members in the town of Hasaka. Yesterday, 5 ISIS prisoners escaped when a Turkish mortar hit an area very near a jail in Kamishli.
We have witnessed Turkish attempts to strike and attack some of those facilities. That is what happened in Kamishli prison, where a big number of ISIS terrorists were kept.
You don't know if they were targeting the prison or whether they just happened to hit it?
Well, I think we can say that it was targeted because Turkey is part of the international coalition, and the whole international coalition members know about the location of those facilities. So for sure Turkey knows, and any strikes, even if they didn't maybe hit directly or they were close to it, they are a risk for the security of this facility and for the security of the people inside it, and eventually it led to the escape of 5 ISIS terrorists.
US forces haven't actually left northeastern Syria. They patrolled through at least 2 towns last night. Maybe someone has told President Trump that words on a phone call have consequences.
And amongst the consequences are, of course, the human consequences. The UN World Food Programme says that 100,000 people have been displaced. And where are they going? Most of them are going to a city called Hasaka, which is south of here. They think it's safer. But you know what? The Turkish forces hit the town's major water supply. I think that was yesterday. And certainly what I'm being told from Hasaka is there is no water. So how are people supposed to survive? People here have endured 8 years of war now. And what they're seeing now is an increased destabilization. And if the American policy doesn't change, if they don't manage to stop President Erdogan from continuing his onslaught, then it's going to get ever more unstable and impossible for people to live.
Lindsay, thanks very much. Our foreign affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, is on the Turkish side of the border in Akçakale. That town was targeted by Kurdish-led forces in Syria today. Jonathan.
Kathy, I'm standing a few hundred metres away from the Turkish artillery positions, and we've heard sporadic shelling of the Syrian border this afternoon. Not as much as you might think. Perhaps the Turkish operation is moving more slowly, less intensely than some media reporting might suggest, although controlling Turkey's Syrian Arab proxies might prove much harder on the ground. We've also seen Syrian Kurdish forces mortaring the town of Akçakale, where I am now, this morning, with no casualties reported. In fact, no casualties on the Turkish side of the border reported today. And the suspicion is that the next phase of the Turkish operation will be to attack and to take the town of Tal Abyad, just across the border from here, where that mortar fire is coming from. The Arab League has condemned Turkey's operation, hardly surprising given that nothing quite unites Arab states quite as much as their dislike of the former Ottoman power. But far more significant, I think, is Germany announcing a ban on arms sales to Turkey, on anything which could be used in the Syrian operation, because of course it puts pressure on other European allies to impose arms bans too, and that is something the UK, a close NATO ally of Turkey, will not want to do.
Well, is there anything that could stop President Erdogan's operation now?
Well, I think you have to remember the words of Steve Mnuchin, the US Treasury Secretary, last night. He said we can shut down the Turkish economy if we need to. I think more and more countries are thinking about sanctions, including the UK. This is the biggest breakdown in relations between Turkey and its NATO allies since its invasion of Cyprus in 1974. And remember, Turkish troops are still in Cyprus over 40 years later. Nobody wants to impose sanctions on a NATO ally. President Erdogan revels in his isolation, in telling his people that he's standing up against the West. But we haven't seen the most serious part of this operation yet, which is the plan to resettle 2.5 million Syrian refugees in the buffer zone which Turkey is creating. And I suspect that to stop that, more and more countries will be thinking about sanctions in the next few days or weeks.
Jonathan, thanks very much. Well, I'm joined now by Elif Sarakan, a Kurd from Turkey herself and an activist for the Kurdish women's movement. Elif Sarakan, are you in touch with people in northeast Syria? Do you know how they're faring?
Yes, I'm in touch with a number of friends particularly, but especially through them, therefore other people as well. I mean, the feeling there is a combination of course, fear, anger, but also determination that the sacrifice made in the defeat of ISIS, 11,000 martyrs, 22,000 wounded, will not be in vain. And therefore, many people have had to flee, you know, possibly and probably because it's people with young kids, so they have to obviously put those children before any other feeling. But a lot of people, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, are choosing to stay because they believe that leaving will contribute to the realizing of what Erdogan intends to do, which is to ethnically cleanse the region. And he's officially announced this. This is not speculation. And it's unusual, actually, for a world leader to announce that he's going to commit war crimes before he does it.
Although he says that many of the Kurds are terrorists. That's his reason for doing this.
So, you know, it's an absurd, illegitimate description that he uses that no one believes. Even, I feel like he probably doesn't believe it himself. He needs to have a rhetoric of propaganda, of course, to somehow justify this, because the Turkish economy has been weak for a long time. Domestically, he's having a lot of issues of losing popularity. There's a new party that may be formed as an alternative to the AKP. So unfortunately, for a century, what many Turkish leaders do, or leaders of the Turkish Republic do, is attack and massacre the Kurds to become a war hero, to be able to maintain or develop support again.
Well, he seems pretty determined to go ahead with this. If you're saying people are determined to stay in that border region, what is going to be the impact of that?
I mean, the impact is multifold, of course, which is exactly why something needs to be done as soon as possible. You know, we've already seen a possible resurgence of ISIS. You know, there's reports of ISIS prisoners escaping from prisons in Kamishlo. There's camps that ISIS families were staying, and there's riots there. But also, it's not just the resurgence of ISIS, but obviously puts the lives of millions at risk. You know, that region is home to 5 million people, about 3 million Kurds, but not just Kurds, it's Arabs, it's many Christian groups, there's Yazidis. It's also going to add to the international refugee crisis.
And briefly, when you talk about, you know, something must be done, the US has warned Turkey not to overstep the mark. We've heard about what's happening with Germany. Does that reassure you that the international community is taking some action, briefly?
So the international community, of course, are not happy with this invasion, but more needs to be done. You know, condemnation is obviously an important step, but also the sanctions are important, the halting of arms sales are important, but most importantly, what the Syrian Democratic Forces are asking for urgently is a no-fly zone.